Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about the ETH Bitcoin valuation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. The ETH Bitcoin valuation, as always, is an interesting topic. One of the things that we mentioned is the better way to look at this, honestly, is probably just the ETH Bitcoin market cap ratio. And the reason I say that is because you can see that once upon a time, we were at the range highs, and now we have more or less found ourselves near the range lows, right? And so one of the things I mentioned is that last cycle we saw ETH Bitcoin get this rally up to the bull market support band, wasn't really able to get through on the first attempt, and then it ended up coming back down for a little while and then getting a move back up. So this is a tough position to be in because ETH is basically back where it was in 2019, around the time the Fed ended quantitative tightening. We also know that just if we didn't even have this chart to look at on that back over there, we know that ETH Bitcoin also rallied last year around this time, right? May of 2025 and then May of 2024. You can see though that ETH Bitcoin held strong, and then in July, it really started to fall back down. So what I'm thinking right now is there's still time, theoretically, for ETH Bitcoin to get some weekly closes above the bull market support band, but it hasn't really done so just yet. If ETH Bitcoin is unable to break through the bull market support band in the next couple of weeks, then I think the most likely outcome at that point would then be, say, a drop where it then tries to find a higher low somewhere potentially in the Q3 timeframe, right? I mean, one of the reasons why I'm a little cautious, and again, that's not to say that it can't break through. I mean, it always could, but one of the reasons I remain a little cautious is not intrinsically because of ETH Bitcoin. It's because the altcoin market on its Bitcoin pair, I think, needs to go lower, right? So if you look at like alt Bitcoin pairs, you can see they've been holding support for a long time. They're now at 0.32, which is where we said they were likely going to go in June. Ultimately, I think they need to go to 0.25. Does that happen now, or does it happen later? Do alt Bitcoin pairs rally back up for a couple of weeks and then come back down, or do they just capitulate now? And, depending on how that plays out, obviously will have a big effect on ETH Bitcoin. Like if alt Bitcoin pairs can get a rally for a couple of weeks like they did the last couple of Junes before then rolling over in Q4 or early Q4, then you could still see further upside by ETH Bitcoin. But the problem that I still have is that I think that the way that alt Bitcoin pairs could go to the range lows of 0.25 is I wonder if they need to be escorted there by ETH Bitcoin, right? So like if ETH Bitcoin were to drop back down into Q3, that could help all Bitcoin pairs go to those same levels. And again, I know a lot of people didn't think ETH Bitcoin would ever go to where it did, and it still went there, right? Ethereum went home on its USD pair. ETH Bitcoin went really, really low. I hope that it puts in that this is the bottom for ETH Bitcoin. Hope's not really a great investing strategy, but the way that it could be the low is if between now and whenever it potentially tests it, if QT were to end. If QT doesn't end, it's always a chance. There's always a chance that it goes lower, right? And that's a reality that everyone has to accept. It might make you uncomfortable. It makes me a little bit uncomfortable, but it's something to consider. If it does go to a lower low, and it just keeps on going lower, I mean, at that point, it'd be really hard to look at that chart in the same way, because for the longest time I've looked at the chart like this. I've said, all right, it's putting in higher lows, but it's also been putting in lower highs, right? So I've always sort of thought about it as like, potentially it is, converging to, potentially whatever the quote unquote fair value is. Like maybe that's what's going on. It's just converging to that value, and it's putting in lower highs and higher lows. For the last few years, obviously a lot of people criticize me because they faded this entire move to the downside thinking it was going to go up, and they're like, well, look at all the higher lows. And I was like, yeah, I see the higher lows, but do you see the lower highs? Right? And so it's a matter of being objective, right? Like we can see the lower highs, we can also see the higher lows, but this is still technically a higher low for now as long as it holds. If it goes lower, there's not a lot of wiggle room between the low from the last cycle and the low that already was put in. So if ETH Bitcoin does end up falling back in a little bit into Q3, then you would want to see it put in a higher low somewhere in this range, or potentially a double bottom. If you can get a double bottom here, then perhaps by that point it could break through, if it's also accompanied by lower interest rates and an end to quantitative tightening. So that's what I would ultimately be looking at. And every single week, right? I mean, obviously, I know you guys have been wanting videos on this every single week. I see them. And I honestly, if we can be honest with each other, which I think we can at this point, I've been stalling, right? Because I keep thinking, like, I'm like, well, if this thing could just get a weekly close up here and make it a lot easier, make it a hell of a lot easier. And then perhaps at that point, you know, it would follow a different path, right? Where it got weekly closes above the bull market support band. But every week that it goes up there, it just ends up being a wick. And then it comes right back down. And so it makes me a little skittish to, you know, to want to talk about it. Because I'm like, well, just give me a weekly close above the 21-week EMA, and then things might change. But as long as these are just wicks, I have to be open-minded to, you know, something like that, where it drops in, gets back up to the bull market support band, then maybe drops a little bit lower by Q3, and then perhaps bounces higher as you get into Q4. You know, and that would be if it basically played out like what happened last cycle, okay? If it just can blast through, that would be more like what happened in 2017. It's really a tough call, right? It's really a tough call. If it is going to go down here, it's more than likely due to Bitcoin getting a correction into Q3. The good news for Ethereum holders is that altcoins are now bleeding to Ethereum just like they used to bleed to Bitcoin. So Ethereum, arguably, I sort of put it in between Bitcoin and altcoins. But altcoins, arguably, are oscillators at best against Ethereum as well. And you can see that altcoins just came up to the range highs not too long ago. So when they come up to the range highs, what happens? You guys know me. When it hits the range high, it's just time to become deterministic about it eventually going to the range low. Does that mean it has to immediately go there? Absolutely not. I mean, you can see over here in 2017, 2018, it got up there, came down, and then rallied back up, but then it still eventually faded back down. It didn't go that much higher than it already had. So for me, with all ETH pairs, I'm operating deterministically in the sense that I think they're going to bleed back down to the range lows. Does that mean they can't pop back up occasionally? No, they could, but I do think for a long time, alts have been bleeding to Bitcoin. Now, I think alts are also bleeding to Ethereum. And when you combine, you know, Bitcoin dominance plus ETH dominance, what you'll notice is that those two metrics have been trending higher, right? ETH dominance has been going up, and so has Bitcoin dominance. Now, one interesting thing about ETH dominance is that it actually wicked below the low from 2019, right? And it had a really big rally, right? It had a really big rally back up. Now the question is, does it have sort of a single rejection or a couple rejections here before ultimately breaking through? And it's hard to really know. Right now, I feel like I slightly lean towards some weakness by ETH Bitcoin in Q3, not because of ETH, but because I think that altcoins need to go lower on their Bitcoin pairs. And I feel like one way for that to happen is for ETH Bitcoin to just kind of not go anywhere for a few months. If that happens, that could help escort the altcoin market to the range lows, right? The other thing to consider is if you go over to the year-to-date ROI and we're going to look at asset pairs and look at ETH Bitcoin, one of the things you'll notice if you pull up, say, 2025, you can also see there was a rally around the same time in 2024, but then as we got later into the year, it then faded down. If you look at 2023, there was also a rally around this time, but then as you got later into the year, it faded down. 2022, there was a big rally into Q3, right? That was when the merge occurred. So there's a scenario where ETH Bitcoin just goes sideways for a while or slightly lower, which would allow altcoins to go to the range lows. For me, I'm satisfied where ETH Bitcoin went. Like, I don't think it needs to go lower, but I think altcoins need to go lower on their Bitcoin pairs, right? So I think that the bleed that we got for ETH Bitcoin, right? You guys, everyone, you know, if you're here watching this video, you probably saw a lot of my ETH Bitcoin videos, right? This helplessness that Ethereum maxis felt, I think altcoiners need to feel the same way. And I don't think they have felt that. I think they maybe pretend to feel that. But the reality is that the alt Bitcoin chart doesn't look as bad as the ETH Bitcoin chart, right? And it's because ETH Bitcoin bled a lot more. So I think that some of the losses for ETH Bitcoin might be behind us, but I still think the altcoin market on its Bitcoin pair needs to ultimately go lower, even if it bounces in the short term. And I guess the case to bounce in the short term is if alt Bitcoin pairs just find support here. That's not what I'm rooting for. I want to be clear. I would root for just alt Bitcoin pairs to capitulate below this level and just go to the range lows in the summer of 2025, kind of like they did in the summer of 2019, right? That's what I would like to see. And in order for that to happen, it might require ETH Bitcoin to not, to struggle a little bit longer, to ultimately see that play out. Again, you need to be fluid with this at this point because ETH Bitcoin has gone pretty low. If it's gonna go lower, I think it's got to be on a Bitcoin correction. Because if you get a Bitcoin rally, I mean, it just seems like since Ethereum went home on its USD pair, it seems like it would be more likely that ETH USD would potentially keep pace with Bitcoin at this point in the cycle, given that Ethereum went home, right? If you look at like ETH USD, we know that Ethereum went home, and if you're not familiar with what that means, if you go look at the lower logarithmic regression trend line, you can see that ETH went home. And one of the things I mentioned that was in order for ETH Bitcoin to bottom, ETH USD needs to go home. Well, ETH USD did go home. So maybe ETH Bitcoin has bottomed. If ETH USD is to fall back down and fall back in and go to the lower regression band like it did the last couple of cycles, it has to be on a Bitcoin correction. I don't think at this point in the cycle, Ethereum will go back down deep into the regression band without Bitcoin doing something similar, right? Without Bitcoin seeing a similar correction. So, if you look at a chart like this, what I would say is in the worst case scenario for ETH and it falls back into the regression band, what would be a really bullish setup is if ETH goes back down on its USD pair, but then I'm not saying that would be bullish. Obviously, it would be more bullish if ETH USD just goes up. But if ETH USD goes lower, but ETH Bitcoin puts in a higher low, right? That would be a pretty good setup. That's what happened last cycle, right? ETH USD went down here, but it happened on a higher low by ETH Bitcoin. And that's what you're really looking for. You want to get to the point where ETH Bitcoin holds steady despite ETH USD continuing to bleed a little bit. And so with Ethereum, I guess the thing to keep in mind is that it still hasn't really broken back through this trend line where it broke down from, right? So, that's kind of the struggle that ETH USD is having right now, is it hasn't been able to break above that. And if it does, I think you have to just let it run, right? Because at that point, it could run a lot if it can get through this trend line. But if Bitcoin finds that weakness in Q3, which we've been talking about as a likely outcome, then you could see a pullback by Ethereum and it's on its USD pair and Bitcoin pair into Q3, and then maybe renewed strength a little bit shortly after that. So, I still look at a chart like this and just simply wonder, is it repeating what happened last time, where it gets a rally off the low, but then it kind of struggles for a little bit and then eventually finds some renewed strength a little bit later on. A lot of times what you're looking for are double bottoms. They don't always give you double bottoms. I mean, like, had you waited for that in 2016, you'd still be waiting, right? It went up and then got a slight correction and then just blasted through the roof. So you have to be prepared for that, right? And as I said before, I mean, below 1600 was where I was a buyer, right? And I said that many times, right? Below the fair value, I was more optimistic. When looking at the Bitcoin pair, I'm still looking to see, can it break through here? If it can't, it just means we kick the can down the road a couple months and then try again, right? And then if we still can't, we might kick the can down the road again and then try again. So keep an outlook for that. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. And again, I'll see you guys next time. Bye.